New empires. The objectives are: 1. Discuss why the Mauryan Dynasty flourished under Ashoka. 2. Summarize how the Kushan kingdom prospered. And 3. Identify the contributions of the Gupta Empire in the areas of literature, architecture, and science. Now first, beginning with the Mauryan Dynasty. India faced new threats from the west. Really first from the Persian Empire as it expanded in the Middle East, which extended its empire into western India. The other is after the Persian Empire is conquered by Alexander the Great and his Macedonian and Greek soldiers. And their conquest into western India gave rise to the first dynasty to control much of India, which is a consequence of external incursion leading to unification. That is, the Indian people were forced to band together to resist the incursions of the Persians and Alexander the Great. So, by having this external threat, it forced the people to bind together to push them back. And after they do, they're left with a new pattern, a new sort of imperial system in which they have a structure that is no longer fractured, but bound together in a monarchical, dynastic sense that we see in other places. And this is exactly how the Mauryan Dynasty emerges. The founder, Chandragupta Maurya, he drove out the foreign forces and established a capital in his new Mauryan Empire in northern India. And the king divided his empire into provinces using large armies and a secret police that followed his orders. So after gaining political power, after unifying the people and leading the resistance against Alexander the Great and the other Greeks, he is able then to maintain his power and to build a power base in the north and establish a capital and divide up into provinces his territory, which would really be the only way to maintain that kind of power and control over various regions, where you would put someone that you trust over those various provinces. And it would be controlled by large armies. And of course, the need for secret police in a dictatorial, totalitarian sort of sense is to make sure that the people are not rebelling. Or even a secret police to watch the people in charge of the provinces that he's placed him. There's no question, at least, that Chandragupta was a big man. He was not physically, but in a political sense. Here you can see that in the art, that he is a large figure compared to those around him. Kind of an image in art of his standing socially among his peers. Now, the reign of his grandson, Ashoka, is usually considered the height of the Mauryan Empire. And it really flourished under Ashoka. And he is considered the greatest ruler in the history of India, period, not just the Mauryan Empire. He converted to Buddhism and ended up being a huge push factor for Buddhism throughout India, yes, but outside of India as well. Buddhism set up hospitals for people and animals, of course, on his coin. And after Ashoka's death in 232 BCE, the Mauryan Empire began to decline because he was the absolute height of this power. In fact, one of the lasting legacies that he ushered into was the sending of missionaries, Buddhist missionaries, up into China and Southeast Asia. Now, inevitably, we're going to see that Buddhism does not take long-term hold in India, but will, in fact, do so in China and in Southeast Asia. So really, Ashoka, in a historical sense, is most responsible and influential for the spread of Buddhism throughout the globe. Now, what came after is the Kushan kingdom. Now, there was a number of new kingdoms that arose on the edges of India in the regions known as Bactria, today might be considered Afghanistan and Pakistan, and you had nomadic warriors in that territory, but they seized power and established a new Kushan kingdom right along the Kushan mountains. And the Kushans spread over northern India, eventually coming into India as far as the central Ganges Valley. And so this Kushan kingdom, while its local power, its power base was in that Bactria region, they spread into northern India, a sort of external incursion to some extent. Now the Kushans prospered from trade, and primarily trade between India and the Mediterranean Sea, largely along the infamous Silk Road. And it was called so because of the most popular and most valuable product being sold and traded and bartered along that route, which was a silk from China. Now, the Silk Road, which had arisen sometime between 200 BCE and 100 CEE, was from Chang'an through Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean. That was kind of the main route for the Silk Road and the expansion of trade. Now, really largely, you would only have luxury goods that were carried along the Silk Road, not things that were locally sourced or locally found. You wouldn't really have much food found on the Silk Road in terms of trade, but things that were incredibly valuable, like spices, silk, of course, teas, ivory, textiles in general, pepper, and porcelain. Now, of course, it's dangerous business going from China across the Middle East to the Mediterranean. Now, of course, there are various exchanges occurring at that moment. China might stop into Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia and the Middle East might take that to the edges of the Mediterranean, and then from the edges of the Mediterranean deeper into the Mediterranean to the Romans or the Greeks or something. Now, of course, this is dangerous business. Why? Because of the inherent dangers from disaster, natural or otherwise, from bandits or anything like that. So, of course, you're going to have to be really careful on what, in fact, you're trying to trade and what you're transporting. Is it worth the coin? Well, in fact, silk and these other luxury goods will be very valuable. Now, of course, the Silk Road is not some simple trade route, some simple straight line, some simple road. It was a complex network of trade. And as you can see from this map here, that the complex trade networks were quite, in fact, complex, going all along the coast, not just across land. And you have a deep, if you'll notice, deep trade routes and various networks along northern India, up into Bactria, the Hindu Kush regions, modern-day Afghanistan. So that's a complex route right there, coming from Southeast Asia, coming from China, coming from India itself, and going up into the Mediterranean. So, of course, the Kushan Empire is going to thrive on the taxation and the transportation of these trade goods. Now, eventually, the Kushan kingdom came to an end in the 3rd century CE. And when invaders from Persia overran it, we end up seeing a new kingdom eventually arise. Under Samragupta, he expanded the empire into surrounding areas. Now, of course, I'm mispronouncing his name, but Samragupta Gupta eventually established this new empire, the Guptas, and became really the dominant political force throughout northern India. And again, here we're just briefly looking at the regional history, a little bit out of our time zone and gaze, but we're looking at this in a broad picture. Now, of course, what did this Gupta Empire look like? I mean, it flourished through trade and through wealth. The greatest of its cultural achievements was really characterized by the Chinese traveler Kushan, who spent several years there in the 5th century talking about its wealth, talking about its prosperity. So, of course, the trade had made it so. No question. Now, the Gupta Empire actively engaged in trade with China, Southeast Asia, and the Mediterranean. And this is really one of the high points of trade during the Gupta Empire. Much of their wealth came from religious trade, as pilgrims from across India and as far away as China came to visit the major religious centers, particularly Buddhist. Because in India, while Buddhism had not taken a huge hold, it had blossomed in China and Southeast Asia, which, of course, these people want to take pilgrimages to the land from which the Buddha came from. And so, naturally, through pilgrimage and trade in that sense, you end up having a great deal of wealth created. Now, beginning in the late 5th century CE, we see invasions by nomadic Huns from the northwest that gradually reduced the power of the empire. Inevitably, these Huns will leave Asia, will leave East Asia and South Asia in general, cross the Mediterranean and the Eurasian steppe, and eventually go into Europe. But here they're causing major problems for China and for South Asia, India. And this is really one of the major factors that led to the collapse of the Gupta Empire. Now, leaving the politics aside, let's take a look at culture and particularly literature, because the literature has a lasting legacy in India. Now, the earliest known Indian literature came from the Aryan tradition, those Aryan Indo-European group that migrated into India. And so this Aryan tradition really formed the Vedas. Now, the Vedas are various religious writings that eventually get written down, but religious sayings that are connected to these deep, ancient religious traditions. Now, after the Aryan conquest of India and the development of a writing system, the Vedas were written down in that written language, Sanskrit. And these carry an ancient knowledge about the gods and how one should interact with them. Now, India's greatest historical epics come through the Vedas. The Mahabharata, forgive my pronunciation, and Ramayana. Now, to talk a little bit about these, Mahabharata consists of over 90,000 stanzas, making it the longest poem in any written language anywhere, the longest poem written. And it contains one of the most famous sections of the book, which is in the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, which is really a sermon on the god Krishna. And it really explains and explores who this guy is, Krishna. And in the Ramayana, it's an account of the fictional ruler Rama, who is banished from the kingdom and forced to live as a hermit in the forest. And one of the ancient India's most famous authors was Kalidasa, who lived during this Gupta dynasty, who wrote all about these sorts of things. Now, of course, the Vedas have a long religious standing that still are practiced and used today, usually through Brahmin and priests that would memorize all of these lines and would chant them and speak them in various rituals. Now, architecture also has a huge impact and long-standing tradition. The desire to spread the ideas of Gautama Buddha inspired really the creation of great architecture. Now, some of the major elements of the architecture, the pillar, the stupa, and the rock chamber. So let's talk about each one of those. First, let's talk about the pillar. So many stone pillars were erected along side roads to mark sites related to events in the Buddha's life. So any place that they could find a location where some key event occurred, they would erect some kind of pillar, which would signify to pilgrims, hey, this is where it's at. Come and visit this. The other is a stupa, which was originally meant to house a relic of the Buddha, and it would be some kind of structure that was built around some kind of relic that people would come and visit, kind of like a temple or something, and people would come and visit that and see the holy site. And then other early architectural attempts at creating rock chambers, caves out of rock cliffs in which monks would live as a holy site. And some of these places are just breathtaking, with people living here 1,000+ years. So a long, deep tradition in architecture in India. Now, sciences. Many recognized that the Earth was a sphere and that rotated on its axis and revolved around the sun. And particularly, one famous then person, Aryabhata, is the most famous mathematician of the Gupta Empire. He was one of the first scientists known to have used algebra. And in fact, it is within India that the concept of zero occurs. And it is not, as some have said, the Arabs or Muslims who devise zero, but rather the Arabs adopt zero from India, which inevitably, in the long run, gets adopted in Europe from the Arabs who got it from India. So it seems that the concept of zero, which is vital to mathematics, particularly algebra and so on, beyond basic arithmetic, one really needs zero. And it seems to have been developed by the Indians, really connected to a mystical Veda tradition. Now, the objectives were: 1, discuss why the Mauryan Dynasty flourished under Ashoka; 2, summarize how the Kushan kingdom prospered; and 3, identify the contributions of the Gupta Empire in the areas of literature, architecture, and science.